Emily Carter learned early how to trust quietly. It showed in the way she listened more than she spoke, in how she folded her expectations into careful corners and carried them without complaint. At 26, she believed steadiness mattered more than fireworks, and that belief had led her to Ryan Mitchell. He was warm, funny, and unfailingly charming in public, someone who knew how to fill silences and make people feel chosen. With him, Emily imagined a life that would grow slowly and last. They met 3 years earlier at a community fundraiser, both volunteering at the same table, both laughing at the same small mistakes. Ryan admired her composure. Emily admired his ease. Their relationship unfolded without drama. They moved in together after a year, adopted routines that fit like old sweaters, and spoke about the future in practical terms. Marriage wasn't urgent, but it was assumed. Emily liked that assumption. It felt safe. Sophia Blake was there from the beginning, woven into Emily's life like a bright thread. They had met in college, bonded by late nights, and shared ambitions, and carried that closeness into adulthood. Sophia was bold where Emily was reserved, quick to speak and quicker to dream. She celebrated loudly and grieved dramatically. People noticed her when she entered a room, and she liked being noticed. Emily never begrudged her that. Friendship, she believed, wasn't a competition. Sophia became part of the couple's orbit naturally. She joined them for dinners, knew Ryan's favorite takeout orders, and teased him like a sister might. Ryan responded easily to her energy, laughing a little louder when she was around. Emily noticed, but she trusted the structure of her life. Trust had always rewarded her before. Still, small changes began to collect like dust on a shelf. Easy to ignore, impossible to miss once you look closely. Ryan checked his phone more often, angling the screen away without thinking. He came home later than usual, explanations casual and unconvincing. When Emily asked about his day, his answers shortened, his attention drifting. She told herself it was stress. Work had been demanding. People went through phases. Sophia, on the other hand, grew more attentive. She called Emily daily, asked careful questions about her relationship, listened with a seriousness that felt new. She offered advice without being asked, always framed as concern. "You deserve to feel secure," she would say, her voice soft, her eyes steady. Emily appreciated the care. She didn't see the hunger beneath it. One evening, as rain streaked the windows and the city hummed below, Emily cooked dinner alone. Ryan had texted to say he'd be late again. Sophia arrived instead, shaking water from her hair, carrying a bottle of wine. They ate at the small table by the window, talking about work and old memories. Sophia watched Emily closely, as if measuring her resilience. "You've changed," Sophia said gently. "You're quieter." Emily smiled. "Maybe I'm just tired." Sophia reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "If you ever feel like something's wrong, promise you'll tell me." Emily promised. Promises were easy then. A week later, Emily met Margaret Mitchell for coffee. Margaret was Ryan's aunt by marriage, a woman with calm eyes and an observant nature. She had always treated Emily with a careful kindness, as though she saw more than she said. They spoke about family and weather, about nothing and everything. As they parted, Margaret hesitated. "Take care of yourself," she said. Her tone weighted. Emily nodded, puzzled, unaware that concern often arrives before explanation. At the tea home that night, Ryan was distant, distracted by a message he didn't explain. When Emily asked if something was wrong, he kissed her forehead and told her not to worry. She wanted to believe him. Wanting felt easier than knowing. The unease grew subtle roots. Emily found herself replaying conversations, searching for missed meanings. She noticed how Sophia spoke about Ryan with a familiarity that felt too intimate, how she defended his absences before Emily could question them. None of it was proof. It was just enough to unsettle. One afternoon, Emily stopped by Sophia's apartment unannounced, carrying a bag of groceries and an apology for not calling first. The door was unlocked. Laughter floated from inside. Ryan's laughter unmistakable. Emily froze, heart stuttering, then stepped back into the hallway. She told herself she was being foolish. Friends could laugh together. There were a dozen explanations kinder than the truth. She left without knocking. That night, Emily lay awake beside Ryan, listening to his breathing. She studied the familiar curve of his face, the person she had chosen and been chosen by. Trust, she reminded herself, was an action, not a feeling. It required courage. She would not become suspicious without cause. She would not let doubt reshape her. Yet as dawn thinned the dark, a quiet certainty settled in her chest. Something was shifting, moving beyond her reach. She didn't know what it was yet, only that the life she believed in was no longer as solid as it once seemed. Emily rose quietly, made coffee, and watched the city wake. The future still existed, but it no longer felt assured. Somewhere between loyalty and truth, a choice waited for her, one she wasn't ready to face, but could no longer ignore. Emily Carter did not confront the unease immediately. She carried it with her through ordinary days, testing its weight against routine, hoping it would dissolve under reason. But suspicion, once named, grows impatient with silence. It sharpened her attention, tuned her to the spaces between words, the moments when Ryan Mitchell's affection felt rehearsed rather than instinctive. Ryan became careful in ways that betrayed him. He volunteered explanations before Emily asked questions. He smiled too quickly, touched her shoulder as if to reassure himself more than her. When she spoke, he listened with half his focus, the other half tethered to a phone that rarely left his hand. Emily noticed how often Sophia Blake's name appeared in passing. Always justified by convenience or coincidence, Sophia, for her part, remained present, almost vigilant. She checked in often, offered distractions, suggested outings when Emily seemed withdrawn. Her concern felt sincere, but it hovered too closely, like a shadow trying to match Emily's steps. Emily wondered when attentiveness had turned into surveillance. The truth announced itself without ceremony on a quiet afternoon. Emily left work early, hoping to surprise Ryan with dinner at a cafe they loved. She arrived first and chose a table near the window. As minutes passed, she watched the street fill with strangers and stories that weren't hers. Then she saw them. Ryan and Sophia entered together, unaware of her presence. They were close, shoulders brushing, laughter shared with an ease that no longer belonged to Emily. Sophia leaned in as she spoke, her hand resting briefly on Ryan's arm, not in greeting, but in claim. Ryan didn't pull away. He smiled at her the way he once smiled at Emily, unguarded, intimate. Emily stood before they noticed her. Her voice was steady, surprising even herself. Ryan turned, color draining from his face. Sophia's expression flickered through shock, guilt, and something like relief. There were no raised voices, no dramatic denials. Ryan spoke first, stumbling over apologies that sounded practiced. He said it hadn't been planned, that feelings had grown unexpectedly. Sophia said nothing at first, then claimed honesty as her defense. She said she hadn't meant to hurt Emily, as though intent could undo outcome. Emily listened, absorbing each word with a calm that felt unreal. Betrayal had a sound now, a shape. It lived in Ryan's lowered gaze and Sophia's trembling hands. When Emily finally spoke, she asked one question only: how long? The answer settled heavily between them, long enough to make every memory suspect. Emily left without finishing her coffee. She walked until her legs ached, until the city blurred into motion without meaning. At home, she packed a bag with essentials, moving carefully, as if sudden gestures might break something fragile inside her. Ryan arrived later, full of regret and confusion, asking for time, asking for understanding. Emily gave him neither. She asked him to leave. That night, she slept alone for the first time in years. The silence was vast but honest. Sophia called the next morning. Emily did not answer. Messages followed, layered with explanations and pleas for forgiveness. Emily read none of them. She understood now that betrayal rarely comes from strangers. It arrives through familiarity, through trust offered freely and returned broken. Days passed. Emily moved through them with deliberate composure, returning to work, answering questions with neutral phrases. Inside, she unraveled quietly. She mourned not just the relationship, but the version of herself who had believed in it without reservation. Trust, once fractured, demanded reconstruction from the ground up. Ryan tried again, appearing at her workplace, sending letters that spoke of love rediscovered too late. Emily returned them unopened. She knew that love, which required betrayal to define itself, was not love she could carry forward. News traveled quickly. Friends chose sides or avoided the subject altogether. Emily did not defend herself. She did not need witnesses to validate her pain. She withdrew, choosing solitude over spectacle, truth over explanation. One evening, as she sorted through old photographs, Emily found herself studying a picture taken years earlier at a family gathering. Ryan stood beside her, smiling, while a man she barely remembered stood in the background, older, composed, watching the room rather than commanding it. She recalled his name slowly. Daniel Mitchell, that Ryan's uncle had spoken to her briefly that day, offering quiet encouragement about her career, listening more than he spoke. She remembered thinking he seemed out of place among louder personalities, as if he belonged to a different rhythm entirely. The memory stirred something unexpected, a sense of being seen without expectation. Emily closed the album, unsettled by the direction of her thoughts. The past had no obligation to explain the future. As weeks turned into months, Emily made a decision that surprised those around her. She resigned from her job, packed her belongings, and left the city she had built her life in. There was no dramatic farewell. She needed distance, not drama. She needed space where her identity was not defined by betrayal. That on her last night before leaving, she stood by the window of her empty apartment, city lights reflecting in the glass. She felt grief, yes, but also something else, relief. The truth, once exposed, had freed her from pretending. Emily did not know what waited beyond this ending. She only knew she would not return to what had broken her. Somewhere ahead was a life untouched by lies, a version of love that did not require compromise of self. She stepped away from the window, turned off the light, and closed the door behind her, carrying forward not bitterness, but resolve. Emily Carter arrived in the coastal town with no expectations beyond anonymity. The sea air was sharp and clean, a contrast to the city she had left behind. She rented a modest apartment near the harbor, furnished sparsely, choosing only what was necessary. This new life was not meant to impress anyone. It was meant to hold her while she learned how to stand again. She found work at a small publishing office, editing manuscripts that arrived in uneven stacks. The job suited her. It required patience, precision, and an ability to listen to voices without interrupting them. Her colleagues were polite but distant, respecting the boundaries she placed around herself. Emily was grateful for that restraint. Healing, she had learned, was quieter than pain. Weeks passed before Daniel Mitchell re-entered her life, and when he did, it felt less like coincidence than convergence. Emily noticed him first at a local bookstore, standing in the philosophy aisle, reading the back of a worn paperback. He looked much the same as she remembered, calm, observant, carrying himself with an ease that came from self-knowledge rather than confidence. He noticed her moments later, surprise softening into recognition. They spoke cautiously at first, as if both were aware of the weight their shared history carried. Daniel did not ask about Ryan. Emily did not offer explanations. Instead, they talked about the town, about books, about the quiet pleasure of starting over. Daniel mentioned he had moved there recently for work, overseeing a long-term project that required stability more than ambition. Their meetings became occasional, then expected. They shared coffee after work, walks along the harbor at dusk, conversations that unfolded without urgency. Daniel listened with an attentiveness that felt rare. When Emily spoke, he did not rush to respond or advise. He allowed her words to settle, to exist without correction. In that space, Emily found herself speaking more honestly than she had in months. That Daniel's presence was steady but unobtrusive. He did not intrude on her solitude, nor did he retreat when she reached out. Emily learned that he valued constancy, that he believed affection was proven through reliability rather than declaration. He never mentioned his nephew, and Emily respected the silence. Some truths needed time before they could be handled without harm. As autumn deepened, their connection shifted subtly. Emily noticed how Daniel anticipated her thoughts, how he remembered small details she had mentioned once and forgotten. He noticed, too, the moments when she withdrew, and he met them with patience rather than concern. Their bond grew not through intensity, but through accumulation, shared moments layered gently over one another. One evening, after a long walk along the water, Daniel spoke with a seriousness that commanded attention. He told Emily that he had known about her long before they met again, that he had recognized her name when she left the city and had quietly hoped she was safe. He admitted that he had been searching not to interfere, but to ensure she was not alone. His honesty was unadorned, free of expectation. Emily felt the truth of his words not as pressure, but as care. She realized then that what unsettled her was not his presence, but how natural it felt. There was no urgency to define what they were becoming, yet the direction was unmistakable. Time continued its patient work. Emily's laughter returned, tentative at first, then freer. She invited Daniel into her apartment, into her routines, into the quiet rituals that shaped her days. He accepted each invitation with respect, never assuming more than was offered. In return, he allowed her glimpses into his life, his values, his disappointments, his belief that love should be a place of rest rather than conflict. The question of the future emerged not as a demand, but as a possibility. Practical considerations entered their conversations: stability, companionship, the shared desire for a life unmarked by chaos. Marriage was mentioned once, tentatively, framed not as romance, but as partnership. Emily considered it without fear. The idea felt grounded, almost inevitable. They decided together, without spectacle. The marriage would not erase the past, but it would not be defined by it either. It would be an agreement rooted in trust, a choice made with clear eyes. Emily understood that love could grow from respect, that passion was not the only foundation worth building on. As winter approached, they married quietly at the town hall, witnessed by a handful of acquaintances. There were no grand promises, only sincere ones. Daniel's vows emphasized loyalty and patience. Emily spoke of courage and renewal. When they exchanged rings, the gesture felt less like a beginning and more like a continuation of something already true. That night, as they returned to their apartment, Emily stood by the window, watching the harbor lights shimmer against the dark water. She felt no rush of triumph, no urge to look back. What she felt was steadiness, a sense that she had chosen a life aligned with her values. Yet even in that calm, Emily knew the past had not released her entirely. Threads still connected her to what she had left behind, to people who might one day seek answers or forgiveness. For now, she allowed herself the grace of peace, aware that the quiet she cherished would soon be tested.
Emily Carter had learned to measure time by hunger. By late afternoon, when the light slanted through the dusty windows of the roadside restaurant, her children's quiet had grown heavier than words. Anna held herself together with a seriousness that didn't belong to 7-year-olds, while Noah's small fingers tugged at Emily's sleeve, a question he no longer asked out loud. Emily smoothed his hair and breathed in, steadying herself before stepping toward the counter. She had practiced the sentence in her mind. Polite. Brief. Unassuming. The kind that didn't invite judgment. "Excuse me," she said, her voice soft but clear. "If there's any food that can't be sold tonight, anything at all, I'd be grateful." Behind the counter stood Mark Reynolds, the manager, tall and impatient, a man whose authority came from a name tag and a habit of being obeyed. He glanced at Emily's worn jacket, at the children hovering behind her, and frowned as if they were a problem he hadn't ordered. "We don't give out free food," he said. "This isn't a shelter." Emily nodded quickly. I understand. I just thought wrong, Mark cut in, his eyes flicking to the dining room. A few customers looked up. Emily felt heat rise in her cheeks. She had promised herself she wouldn't cry. She had promised herself she would ask once and leave if the answer was no. Her mind drifted, uninvited, to the life she used to live. Ryan Carter had once laughed easily, had once talked about weekends and savings and the house they'd buy someday. After his promotion, the laughter thinned. He came home late with excuses that smelled like cologne Emily didn't own. When she found the messages, careful words sent after midnight, Ryan didn't deny them. He only said she was imagining things, that stress made her paranoid. The night he stopped coming home, he took his certainty with him and left her with the math of survival. Emily worked mornings at a laundromat, afternoons when she could find them. Bills piled like quiet threats. Pride, once sturdy, had worn down into something brittle. Today, it had finally broken. Please, Emily said, not to Mark alone but to the room. My children haven't eaten since this morning. Mark's mouth twisted. That's not my problem, he said, louder now. You can't just walk in here and beg. I'm not begging, Emily replied, though the word had already done its damage. Anna pressed closer, her eyes wide. Noah shifted his weight from foot to foot, sensing danger without understanding it. Mark leaned forward. You need to leave, he said. Now. Emily turned to go. She had asked. She would leave. But as she reached for Noah's hand, Mark stepped around the counter and grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her sleeve as if to steer her out faster. The suddenness shocked her into stillness. Don't touch me, she said, the words trembling but firm. A hush fell over the restaurant. Plates paused halfway to mouths. An elderly woman at the window, Mrs. Helen Foster, Emily would later learn, set down her fork, her eyes narrowing with concern. I said leave, Mark repeated, his grip tightening. You're causing a scene. Emily's heart pounded. Scenes were for people who could afford consequences. She wasn't one of them. She tried to pull away, careful not to escalate, careful not to give him a reason to justify what he was already doing. I'm going, she said. Please let go. Mark scoffed. Always the same story, he muttered. Women like you. The words struck deeper than his hand. Women like you. The accusation carried a lifetime of assumptions, failure, irresponsibility, moral weakness, each one pressing down on her shoulders. Emily swallowed and stared at the floor, willing herself not to disappear. Outside, the air changed. A low rumble crept through the walls, vibrating the windows. At first, it sounded like distant traffic, easy to ignore. Then it grew louder, closer, a layered growl that turned heads. Mark rolled his eyes. Great, he said. Now we've got noise. The door opened, letting in a rush of cool air and the smell of asphalt. 3 men stepped inside, leather jackets creased with use, their movements unhurried. Jake Sullivan entered first, his gaze sweeping the room with quiet attention. Lucas Moore followed, his posture straight, his eyes assessing. Ethan Brooks came last, pausing just long enough to hold the door for someone behind him who wasn't there, a habit learned from another life. They didn't speak at once. They didn't need to. The room had shifted, as if it had inhaled and forgotten to exhale. Jake noticed Emily immediately, the way she stood angled away from Mark, the tension in her shoulders, the children clinging to her like anchors. Lucas noticed Mark's hand on her arm. Ethan noticed Anna's face, pale and trying to be brave. Mark felt it too, though he pretended not to. He released Emily's arm with a sharp motion, as if he'd decided on his own to be reasonable. "We're close to loitering," he said, projecting confidence that rang hollow. "If you're ordering, order. If not," Jake stepped forward just enough to be heard without raising his voice. "Is there a problem here?" Emily looked up. She hadn't expected help. She hadn't allowed herself to hope for it. The question opened something fragile in her chest. Mark laughed, short and dismissive. "No problem," he said. "Just handling a situation." Mrs. Foster cleared her throat. "I saw what happened," she said quietly, but her words carried. "She asked for food. That's all." Jake nodded once, acknowledging the truth without pressing it. His eyes returned to Emily. "Are you okay?" he asked. Emily hesitated. The honest answer was too large for the room. She settled for the simplest one. "I will be," she said. Outside, the motorcycles ticked as they cooled, a steady reminder that something had arrived and wasn't leaving yet. Mark shifted his stance, recalculating. Emily felt the weight of the moment, the sense that the next breath would matter. She tightened her grip on Noah's hand and straightened her shoulders. Whatever came next, she would face it standing.